Let me tell you a story about how a single moment can change the course of a child's life forever. I was 7 years old when my world shattered. My father, the man who had been my anchor, passed away after battling leukemia. His death was a storm that left behind nothing but destruction and uncertainty. But the true betrayal came the very next day. The doorbell rang. Expecting it to be family, I ran to the door with hopeful eyes, still longing for the warmth of my father's presence. But instead of comforting arms, I was met with strangers. My new parents, as I would soon come to learn. My mother, Julia, stood behind them, avoiding my gaze. I waited for her to explain, to tell me why these people were here, but she simply whispered, "They'll take care of you for a few days." Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And soon my mother's absence became permanent. I spent countless nights curled up in my new bed, crying for my mother to come back for me. But she never did. My biological grandparents visited sometimes, and they offered comfort, but the absence of the woman who had given birth to me loomed over my life like a shadow. When I turned 14, I couldn't ignore my questions any longer. I had known I was adopted for years, but I needed to understand why. What had happened to the mother I once adored? Why had she chosen to leave me behind? That was when the truth unraveled before me, a truth so twisted, so incomprehensible, that it sent chills through my spine. My mother had never wanted me. She was 20 when she became pregnant. A young college student with dreams of a future she hadn't planned to include me in. My father's love had convinced her to stay, to try and be a mother, but it was never truly her choice. And when my father was diagnosed with leukemia, instead of standing by him, she sought comfort elsewhere. With my uncle. 4 years she had hidden their affair, but when my father's condition worsened, Julia saw an opportunity, an escape. She and my uncle had already decided they wanted to be together. Raising me was never part of their plan. They waited until my father's death, then handed me off like a burden they were finally free of. My grandparents had known. They had watched in horror as my mother chose to abandon me, yet they said nothing, for the sake of my dying father. Even my adoptive parents, though astonished by the circumstances, took me in without hesitation, knowing I needed love more than I needed the bitter truth at the time. But the truth found me anyway. And just when I thought it was over, just when I had begun to heal and create a life of my own, Julia came back. A decade of silence broken with a single message, "I miss you." Why now? What did she want from me after all these years? I had no answers, only a storm of emotions brewing within me. Was this regret? A need for redemption? Or was there something far more sinister hidden behind her sudden reappearance? I didn't know it then, but reconnecting with Julia would unravel a past even darker than I had imagined. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth. Chapter 2. Let me tell you a story about how a single message can unravel the fragile piece you've spent years building. I stared at my phone screen, my breath caught in my throat. The words, "I miss you," felt foreign, as though they had come from a stranger. For a decade, my mother had been nothing more than a ghost in my past. Silent, absent, erased from my life like an ink stain wiped clean. And now, just like that, she had reappeared. I debated whether to respond. My heart warred with my mind. Part of me craved answers. Another part wanted to delete the message, to pretend she had never reached out. But curiosity won. "What do you want?" I typed, my fingers trembling. I hovered over the send button for a moment before pressing it. Minutes passed. Then an hour. My phone remained silent. That night, I tossed and turned, sleep evading me as memories I had buried clawed their way back to the surface. The way my mother used to sing me to sleep. The warmth of her arms around me. And the cold, crushing betrayal when she left me behind. At 3:12 a.m. my phone vibrated. My heart pounded as I grabbed it. "Julia asterisk, I just want to talk. Please, can we meet?" 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind. Why now? What had changed? Did she feel guilt? Or was there something more? I typed back, this time with less hesitation. "Where?" The 3 dots appeared. Then vanished. Then reappeared. "Julia, your father's grave. Tomorrow at noon." A chill ran through me. Why would she want to meet there, of all places? I had spent years avoiding that place, unwilling to face the ghosts of my past. But now Julia was pulling me back, forcing me to confront everything I had tried to escape. And deep down, I knew that if I went, I wouldn't walk away unchanged. Chapter 3. I arrived at the cemetery just before noon, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with an eerie silence, the kind that settles over places where the dead rest. Rows of tombstones stretched out before me, but my eyes were locked on one in particular, the one that bore my father's name. Julia was already there. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her face hidden beneath dark sunglasses. The last time I had seen her, I was a broken child, begging her not to leave. Now I was an adult, standing before the woman who had abandoned me. She turned as I approached, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed, removing her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed, exhausted. "I didn't think you'd come," she admitted, her voice softer than I remembered. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Neither did I. Silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. My hands clenched at my sides as I stared at my father's grave, the pain of losing him still raw even after all these years. "I'm sorry," Julia whispered. I let out a bitter laugh. "For what, exactly? Leaving me? Lying to me? Giving me away like I was nothing?" She flinched. "I deserve that." I scoffed, shaking my head. "You deserve worse." For a long time she said nothing. Then, just when I thought she would turn and leave, she did something I never expected. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old, crumpled envelope. "I wasn't ready to be a mother," she admitted. "But that doesn't mean I didn't love you. I want you to know the whole story." I hesitated before taking the envelope. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the letter inside, my eyes scanning the words hastily written in her familiar handwriting. The further I read, the tighter my chest became. Secrets. Lies. Things I had never known about my father, about her, about why she left me. By the time I reached the end of the letter, my hands were shaking. I looked up at Julia, my breath unsteady. "Is this true?" Her expression was pained. Every word. My entire life had been built on a version of events that no longer made sense. The woman I had hated for years was offering me the truth, but was I ready to accept it? I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my pocket. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. Julia nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I understand." As I turned to leave, I knew that this was only the beginning. The past was no longer buried, and now I had to decide what to do with the truth. And somehow I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Chapter 4. I spent the rest of the day staring at the letter Julia had given me. Every sentence unraveled something I thought I knew about my past, about my father, about why she had truly left. But there was something deeper, something she hadn't said outright, something that made my stomach twist with unease. That night, sleep didn't come easy. My mind replayed her words, dissecting them, searching for hidden meanings. The next morning I decided I needed answers. Real answers. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello." My grandmother's voice was warm, cautious. "Grandma, I need to talk to you," I said, gripping the letter in my other hand. "About my mother. About what really happened." A long pause. Then a quiet sigh. "I was wondering when you'd ask." 20 minutes later, I was at her house, sitting at the kitchen table as she poured me a cup of tea, her hands slightly trembling. The air between us was thick with the weight of things left unsaid. "She gave you the letter, didn't she?" Grandma finally asked. I nodded, sliding it across the table. "She told me there was more to the story. That my father wasn't the man I thought he was. That she was afraid." My grandmother pressed her lips together, then picked up the letter, skimming over the words as if she were reliving the past. When she finally looked at me, there was something haunted in her eyes. "She's not lying," she admitted. "But she's not telling you everything either?" A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Grandma exhaled slowly as if choosing her words carefully. "Your father, he was a good man. But there were things about him that you never knew. Things we all kept from you." I leaned forward, my pulse racing. "Like what?" Her fingers trembled against the porcelain cup. "Like the fact that he wasn't just sick before he died, he was paranoid. He believed someone was after him." I felt my breath hitch. "Who?" She hesitated, looking down. "Your uncle." The name sent a bolt of ice through my veins. "Uncle James?" She nodded. "Your mother's affair wasn't just about betrayal. There was something else going on, something darker. Your father thought James was dangerous." The room seemed to close in on me. None of this made sense. My mother had abandoned me to be with James. Why would my father think he was a threat? "I don't understand," I whispered. "Why would he be afraid of James?" Grandma looked me in the eye, her expression grave. "Because he believed James had something to do with his illness." My blood ran cold. I pushed back from the table, my mind spinning. If what she was saying was true, if my father's death wasn't just from his illness, then everything I thought I knew about my past was a lie. And worse, I had just let my mother back into my life without knowing the truth. I stood up abruptly. I need to talk to her again. Grandma reached for my hand. Be careful, sweetheart. I nodded, already heading for the door. Because now, more than ever, I needed to know exactly what Julia was hiding. Chapter 5. I drove to Julia's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My grandmother's words echoed in my head, filling me with a suffocating sense of dread. Had my father really believed my uncle was involved in his illness? And if that was true, what did Julia know? When I pulled up to the address she had sent me, I hesitated. The house was smaller than I expected, unremarkable, nestled in a quiet neighborhood. For some reason, I had imagined something grander, something more fitting for the woman who had shattered my world. But maybe that was the first of many assumptions I had gotten wrong. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately. Julia stood in the doorway, her eyes wary. I had a feeling you'd come back. Let me in, I said, my voice colder than I intended. She stepped aside without a word, and I walked into the dimly lit living room. It smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. My stomach churned. She gestured to the couch. Sit. I didn't. Tell me the truth, I demanded. All of it. Julia sighed, running a hand through her hair. I told you everything in that letter. No, I snapped. You told me what you wanted me to believe. But Grandma told me that Dad thought James had something to do with his illness. That he was afraid of him. Is that true? Julia's face went pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again as if struggling with what to say. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He wasn't wrong to be afraid. A cold chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? She hesitated, then turned away, moving to a small cabinet near the window. From inside, she pulled out an old wooden box, her fingers trembling as she handed it to me. I lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in my father's handwriting. Some were addressed to Julia, others to my grandparents. But the ones that made my blood run cold were the ones addressed to me, letters I had never received. With shaking hands, I picked one up and began to read. If something happens to me, promise me you'll protect our daughter. James has been acting strange. He knows something I don't, and I don't trust him. I don't think this illness is natural. I swallowed hard, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. My father had suspected something. He had been trying to warn them. To warn me. I looked up at Julia, my vision blurring. Why didn't you tell me? Tears filled her eyes. Because I was afraid. Because I thought if I just walked away, I could pretend none of it happened. A surge of rage burned through me. You abandoned me. You let me believe my father's death was just bad luck. How could you do that? Julia wiped her tears, her expression hardening. Because I was weak. And because James made sure I stayed quiet. The room spun. What? She reached for my hands, her grip tight. He threatened me. He told me if I ever spoke about what I knew, I'd regret it. That's why I gave you up. It wasn't just because I didn't want to be a mother, it was because I knew if you stayed with me, you wouldn't be safe. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. Safe from what? Julia glanced around the room as if someone might be listening. Then she leaned in and whispered, from James. From the truth. And that was when I realized, this wasn't just about the past anymore. James wasn't done with us yet. Chapter 6. A story about how the ghosts of our past never truly disappear. I left Julia's house in a daze, my mind whirling with questions that had no easy answers. The weight of my father's letters burned in my pocket, each word cutting deeper than the last. James had threatened her. My father had suspected foul play. And yet, for 10 years I had been left in the dark. As I drove home, a single thought echoed in my mind. If my father was right about James, then I was in danger too. I barely made it through my front door before my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened as I hesitated, then answered. A deep, slow breath came through the line. Then a familiar voice. You shouldn't have gone to see her. Ice filled my veins. James? A low chuckle. I always knew you were smart. But sometimes being smart gets you into trouble. I gripped the phone tighter. What did you do to my father? Silence stretched between us. Then finally he sighed. He didn't know how to leave things alone. Just like you. My stomach twisted. So you admit it? I admit nothing, he said smoothly. But I will tell you this, there are some truths better left buried. A shiver ran down my spine. Is that a threat? Just advice, he replied. Forget about the past. Move on. It'll be better for everyone. I clenched my jaw. I'm not scared of you. Another laugh. You should be. The line went dead. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, my hands shaking. He was watching me. He knew what I was doing. And worst of all, he wasn't afraid. I turned and locked every door in my house, my mind racing. Julia had been running from him for years. My father had tried to warn me from the grave. And now James had made it clear, if I kept digging I wouldn't like what I found. But it was too late. I wasn't running anymore. I pulled my father's letters from my pocket and spread them out on the table, searching for anything I had missed. A word, a clue, a hidden message. And then I saw it. One letter different from the rest. The handwriting was shakier, rushed. And at the bottom, a single line sent my heart racing. Something happens to me, don't trust anyone. Especially not James. I stared at the words, my breath catching. My father had known his time was running out. He had tried to protect me even then. But I was alone now. And James was still out there. Watching. Waiting. And I had just put myself directly in his sights. Chapter 7. How sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should fear the most. I barely slept that night. Every shadow in my room felt like it was moving, creeping closer, waiting for the right moment to strike. James's words echoed in my mind. Asterisk, forget about the past. Move on. It'll be better for everyone. Asterisk. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was finally seeing the truth for what it was. By morning I had made my decision. If James thought he could scare me into silence, he was wrong. I needed more answers, and there was only one place left to go, my grandparents' house. They had stayed in touch with me after I was adopted, but they had always been careful about what they told me. Maybe now, after everything, they would finally tell me the whole truth. The drive was long, filled with nervous energy and a growing sense of unease. When I pulled up to the house, I noticed something strange. Both of their cars were in the driveway, but the house was eerily silent. I knocked once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. Dread curled in my stomach as I reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, unlocking with a soft click. The house was dark. Too dark. Grandma? Grandpa? My voice trembled slightly as I stepped inside. Silence. My heart pounded as I moved through the hallway, checking each room. Everything was in place. Nothing was broken or disturbed. But something felt wrong. And then I saw it. A single envelope, placed neatly on the kitchen table. With my name on it. Hands shaking, I picked it up and tore it open, my breath catching as I read the first line. Asterisk, we're sorry we didn't tell you sooner. We hoped you would never have to know. Asterisk. The words blurred as I read further, dread twisting in my gut. They had known about James. About his secrets. About what really happened to my father. And now they were gone. A noise behind me, a soft creak of a floorboard. I spun around, my pulse hammering. I wasn't alone. Then the lights flickered. And the nightmare truly began. Chapter 8. How the truth can be the most dangerous thing of all. The moment the lights flickered, a wave of icy fear washed over me. My breath hitched, my muscles tensed. I wasn't alone. Someone was here watching me. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The house was silent, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. But I could feel it, the presence of someone lurking just beyond my sight. Then a shadow shifted in the doorway. Who's there? My voice barely sounded like my own, shaky, uncertain. Silence. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out while I still could. But I was frozen, my feet rooted to the spot. The letter in my hands crumpled as my grip tightened. Another creak. Closer this time. I sucked in a breath and forced myself to move. My heart pounded as I reached into my pocket, gripping my phone. No signal. Of course. Because things were never that easy. A low chuckle filled the room, sending a fresh wave of terror down my spine. You should have listened, a voice murmured from the shadows. A voice I knew all too well. James. I turned sharply, scanning the darkness. Where are my grandparents? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. James stepped forward, his face just barely visible in the dim light. There was something unsettling in his expression, something cold, calculating. Gone, he said simply. They knew too much. Rage and fear clashed inside me. What did you do to them? He smirked. Same thing I did to your father. My stomach lurched. My worst fears were confirmed. He took a step closer and I instinctively backed away. You should have let this go, he said, his tone almost regretful. I tried to warn you. My mind raced. I had to get out of here. Fast. Then I saw it, a glint of metal in his hand. I didn't think. I ran. Bolting for the back door, I yanked it open just as James lunged. His fingers grazed my arm, but I tore away, sprinting into the night. My only thought was escape. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. Behind me, James's voice carried through the darkness. You can't run forever. But I sure as hell was going to try. Chapter 9. How survival sometimes means becoming someone you don't recognize. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest with every step. The night swallowed me whole, the thick forest behind my grandparents' house offering little solace as I crashed through the underbrush. James's voice still echoed in my ears, his chilling promise replaying over and over. You can't run forever. But I had no choice. Branches whipped against my arms, stinging like tiny knives, but I barely noticed. My mind raced ahead of me, scrambling for a plan. I needed help, but my phone was useless out here. No service. No chance to call for rescue. Then I saw it, the old hunting cabin. I hadn't been there in years, but I remembered it from when my grandfather used to take me exploring. It was barely more than a shack, but it had a door, walls, and maybe even a weapon I could use. I sprinted toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the door, I nearly sobbed in relief to find it unlocked. I slipped inside and slammed it shut, bracing my back against the rough wood as I tried to quiet my frantic breathing. Silence. I listened, ears straining for any sign that James had followed. The forest was unnervingly still, as if even the creatures knew a predator lurked nearby. I edged away from the door, fumbling in the darkness until my fingers brushed against something familiar, a rusted old rifle mounted on the wall. It hadn't been used in years, but it was heavy, solid. A weapon. I gripped it tightly, positioning myself near the single grimy window. If James came, I wouldn't be helpless. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, a sound. A footstep outside. My pulse spiked. I held my breath as the door handle rattled once, then again, more forcefully this time. James's voice, low and amused. You think you're safe in there? I didn't answer. My hands tightened around the rifle. The door shook as he pounded against it. Come on, let's not make this difficult. Pause. Then, almost playfully, you know, your father locked himself away too. Thought he could keep me out. Rage flared in my chest, overpowering my fear. My father had fought until the end. I would too. I took a steadying breath, raised the rifle, and aimed at the door. James laughed. Oh, this is going to be fun. Then, with a deafening crack, the door burst open. Chapter 10. How the end is never truly the end. The door shattered, splinters exploding into the air as James stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the dim moonlight. My heart pounded, my grip on the rifle tightening. He took a slow step forward, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Go ahead, he taunted. Shoot me. I didn't hesitate. My fingers squeezed the trigger. Click. Nothing. James chuckled, shaking his head. That old thing hasn't worked in years. You really thought? I didn't let him finish. I swung the rifle like a bat, aiming for his head. He ducked at the last second, but I managed to clip his shoulder. He grunted, staggering back, but recovered quickly. Too quickly. He lunged. We crashed to the floor, my back slamming against the rough wood as he pinned me down. His hands closed around my throat, squeezing, cutting off my air. I clawed at his grip, panic surging through my veins. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. No, not like this. I reached blindly, my fingers scrambling against the ground, until they closed around something cold and heavy. The fireplace poker. With the last of my strength, I swung it upward, smashing it into the side of James's skull. He let out a strangled cry and collapsed beside me, his grip loosening just enough for me to shove him off. Gasping, I stumbled to my feet, swaying as my vision cleared. James groaned, blood trickling from his temple, but he wasn't done yet. I could see it in his eyes. So I didn't give him a chance. I raised the poker and brought it down again. And again. Until he stopped moving. Silence filled the cabin, heavy and suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at his lifeless body, my hands trembling. It was over. The weight of everything crashed down on me at once. My father. My grandparents. The years of unanswered questions, of fear and doubt. And now, finally, the man who had stolen everything from me was gone. I stumbled outside, my legs weak beneath me. The night air was crisp, the stars above impossibly bright. I had survived. But the story wasn't over. Not really. Because now I had to live with what I'd done. And I had to make sure no one else ever suffered the way I had. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, I turned my back on the cabin, on the past, and walked away. Not as a victim. but as someone who had finally taken control of their own story. Lesson is for all of us. This is a story about betrayal, resilience, and the power of uncovering the truth. After being abandoned by her mother and adopted into a new family, our protagonist learns the horrifying truth about her biological mother's affair and her uncle's sinister role in her father's death. As she reconnects with her past, she finds herself hunted by the very man responsible for her suffering. In a fight for survival, she refuses to remain a victim and ultimately overcomes the darkness that has haunted her for years. The lesson here is clear. No matter how difficult the situation, staying calm, thinking critically, and taking control of your own story will lead you to a solution. Hardships may test you, but they do not define you. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling content.